Aloha and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the fourth session of the U.S.-Singapore Tech and Innovation Virtual Dialogue, Advancing Sustainable and Equitable Digital Solutions. My name is Crystal Pryor, and I'm Vice President of the Pacific Forum. Pacific Forum's U.S.-Singapore Tech and Innovation Virtual Dialogue is a 6-part online series plus digital publication that examines the collaborative partnership between the United States and Singapore in fostering digital innovation and resilience in Southeast Asia. This series emphasizes the US and Singapore's central role in driving technological innovation in the region against the backdrop of great power competition in the post-COVID-19 era. Participants will reflect on existing developments in digital innovation and nascent areas that are ripe for collaboration. This series will also encourage creative and critical thinking to identify other unexpected disruptors for future collaboration. By the end of the series, we hope participants will have a better grasp on how the US and Singapore can spur digital growth through improved policy coordination, thereby facilitating practical engagements on the exchange of talent, data, expertise, technology, and best practices, which will have positive flow-on effects in the region. Session 3, Forging Digital Standards, Challenges in Intellectual Property and Supply Chains, held last month, explored the cybersecurity landscape of the Indo-Pacific, reviewing common patterns in data breaches. 3 main challenges were discussed in supply chain security: cybercrimes, techno-nationalism, and the danger of over-reliance on foreign supply chains. Supply chain security is a relatively nascent topic, and any solution at a micro level requires cooperation between the private and public sectors. Similarly, effective solutions at a macro level need to be collaborative rather than unilateral. As supply chain security issues continue to evolve, they offer ample opportunities for the US and Singapore to strengthen our partnership. If you missed our previous sessions, you can find links to the event pages with the key findings and video recordings in the chat box now. Now let's take a look at the results from the poll that ran as you all joined this session. So the question was, what do you think is the biggest challenge to the development of renewable energy among countries in Southeast Asia? The top answer was tied between lack of political will and other economic priorities at 40%, second, followed by lack of affordable technology and over-reliance on coal. No one responded uneven capital investment. So let's see if some of these challenges come up in today's discussion. Today's session of the US-Singapore Tech and Innovation Virtual Dialogue, Advancing Sustainable and Equitable Digital Solutions, will explore various digital innovations and solutions that the US and Singapore can leverage in addressing issues related to climate change, renewable energy, and smart cities. Today's discussion will tackle innovation in green technology and how sustainable energy policies can create meaningful job opportunities. We'll also explore equitable smart city solutions to support climate adaptation strategies. Please note that remarks made in today's program are on the record, and a video recording of the session will be made available on the Pacific Forum website and social media in the future. This event is also being live streamed to Facebook. Christian Koshil, Commercial Officer of the Singapore-based International Trade Administration of the US Department of Commerce, will moderate the discussion, which will include feedback and questions and answers with the audience. Participants will be allowed to unmute their mics to ask questions or give feedback, but cameras are disabled throughout the session. We also have interactive features like polling as we go. Here is today's second poll. So the question is, which factor or factors do you think will limit smart city development? So you can choose multiple factors if you want: current policies or regulations, lack of technological innovation, concerns for privacy, or lack of equal access to smart technologies. While we're waiting on those poll results, I'll also note that we have a survey we'd like you to complete after the event concludes. You can view this and the series event website at the link shared in the chat box now. And I will share the poll results. Just give them a couple more seconds to roll in. Okay. So the top answer was concerns for privacy, followed by current policies, regulations, and lack of equal access to smart technologies. The least common response was the lack of technological innovation. So it seems that people are more concerned about the policy sides of things, as well as equitability and privacy concerns. So we'll see how those shake out in today's discussion as well. But now on to today's session. I will hand the mic over to Christian Koshiel to take it from here. Christian, if you would.
Thanks, Crystal. Thank you so much. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody. First of all, let me just say it's an honor to moderate today's discussion between these subject matter experts on this timely really, I'm biased, but fascinating confluence of themes, right, between sustainability and equitable digital solutions. So today we'll have two speaker presentations together, followed by Q&A discussion. This is a friendly reminder for the speakers to keep their presentations to 15 minutes max, so we can have ample time for Q&A. This session is 90 minutes total. We want to respect your time. Note that participants will submit their questions in the Q&A box as you have them. So during the presentations, there's no need to save them to the end, please. You may also raise your hand during the Q&A sessions using the raise hand function. Today's presenters for our session on advancing sustainable and equitable digital solutions are Courtney Weatherby, Deputy Director of the Stimson Center's Southeast Asia Program and a research analyst with the Energy, Water, and Sustainability Program, and Dr. Natalie Pang, Senior Lecturer and Deputy Head at Communications and New Media Department, and Principal Investigator at the Center for Trusted Internet and Community at the National University of Singapore and US. So first up, Courtney Weatherby's work focuses on infrastructure and energy development challenges in Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific, particularly food, water, energy, nexus issues in the greater Mekong sub-region. Weatherby was lead author on a range of technical and policy studies, including Thailand's Energy Development Pathways report in collaboration with PACT, and the Stimson Center report's Alternative Development Pathways for Thailand's Sustainability Electricity Trade with Laos. Before joining Stimson, Courtney worked with the Center for Strategic International Studies and the State Department. She holds an MA in Asian Studies from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and a BA in East Asian Studies from Dickinson College. Courtney, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian, and I'm delighted to be here with everyone today. I'm going to focus my conversation really on the starting point for renewable energy, looking at what's going on with energy in Southeast Asia broadly, and then looking at opportunities to digitalize the energy sector and opportunities for collaboration on that issue set between the United States and Singapore. So I think many of you are probably familiar with the energy situation in Southeast Asia. Energy demand is expected to rise really rapidly in coming decades, and national plans across all 10 ASEAN countries anticipate a cumulative energy demand growth of about 60% through 2040. When you're looking at sort of an annual basis, this means that electricity growth each year is 4% annually. That's actually double what we see in most other parts of the world. And some countries in ASEAN, like Cambodia, experience double-digit electricity demand growth every year, even up to 20% growth, requiring a massive build-out in the new power generation. At the same time, I think we're all familiar with the rising pressures and concerns about climate change and the need to limit carbon emissions. ASEAN is heavily fossil fuel dominated energy supply right now. And globally, it's a little bit out of step. We've seen globally the transition of investment starting in the early 2010s to shift from fossil fuel capacity generation over to renewable energy technologies. However, most investment in ASEAN in the short to medium term is still in the fossil fuel sector, particularly looking at natural gas as kind of a bridge fuel from coal towards renewable energy. So there's a need for most countries in ASEAN not only to expand their energy supply, but also to start that transition away from traditional power sources like hydropower, large-scale hydropower, coal, and other fossil fuels towards alternatives like solar and wind. And as this transition is ongoing, digitalization is actually going to be a key factor in most countries' ability to effectively and successfully make that transition without disruptions to the energy supply. So many of you are probably familiar with sort of the unique challenges for renewable energy compared to traditional power sources. Solar, wind power, both operate very differently. They only produce electricity when the sun is shining or when the wind is blowing, and you can't just turn them on or off to meet demand changes like you can with traditional sources where you add more fuel and you can essentially operate things dispatchably. So this leads to greater demands on the utilities as they have to work to balance significant variation in energy production from new sources. And there's also a challenge of decentralization as we see more and more producers coming on who are installing rooftop solar installations, whether that's at a household level or more commonly at an industrial level for commercial buildings or warehouses or manufacturing plants. This leads to a huge proliferation in the number of grid connections. Just as an example, Vietnam has 378 operational commercial scale power plants, but they have more than 100,000 individual solar rooftop units that are now connected to the grid. So that puts a demand on the utilities to be able to track all of the information about who's producing electricity, how much they're producing, and what they're putting into the system. It's just a massive change of scale for what needs to be managed in terms of information and in terms of electron flow coming into and out of the grid. So this really requires more data collection, it requires more data processing, and it requires the ability to rapidly respond through changing the operations of the grid and sometimes of power generation plants. It's a big change to the overall management of the energy system. So in this space, digital technologies are really important for not only ensuring that the grids remain stable as you incorporate ever higher amounts of renewable energy into the system, but it also requires it also leads to rather more efficient operation of the system. So some of these changes can be physical. So that's, for instance, utilizing smart meters to help track second-to-second changes in electricity generation from a power plant or demand draw from the grid, better data collection from those smart meters, and from other uses of electricity inside the grid operation system can allow for better analysis. You can feed them into advanced algorithms to better predict, based on previous historical examples, when electricity demand is most likely to peak. And this allows for better demand forecasting on the part of utilities and essentially better coordination with the many power plants that are now putting electricity into the system. At the same time, things like better weather forecasting can make a huge difference in the ability to predict when you're likely to see disruptions to solar and wind. So you need to have the investments in that infrastructure to be able to and then also the software side infrastructure and capacity in place to then turn that into changes and plans for operation of the electricity grid. All of this can improve the integration of renewable energy and specifically can improve the effective use of renewable energy so that you don't have, for instance, a solar plant producing electricity that simply isn't getting used by the grid and is essentially wasted production. And ultimately, improved monitoring and analysis can also help identify faults in the system early on and improve the ability to predict when maintenance is needed and thus improve the overall lifespan for a lot of the equipment that supports this energy system. All of this is enabled by investments in sort of the physical infrastructure that we now have accessible to us because of the digital revolution, as well as capacity building and training for the new operational procedures and for what to do with all of this data that we're now flooded with in the energy sector. So we've started to see a lot of success in starting to integrate these monitoring tools in the energy system broadly. A lot of private sector companies in power generation and in the national utilities have started to adopt these practices and these technologies because they see the immediate payoff in terms of saving money and in terms of improving efficiency. The real opportunity for future collaboration apart from taking those lessons learned from existing energy systems in the United States and in Singapore and some of the other case studies globally, the real next step from that is to look at opportunities to use digitalization on the demand side, which is an area set where Singapore is probably the lead in ASEAN, because most ASEAN countries are just getting out of the gate. Many of the other ASEAN countries are still struggling with basic deployment of renewable energy and are still working to expand their grid. So they haven't yet started to look at energy efficiency and demand side management. Singapore is a little bit farther ahead on that front. There's already been investment in a number of energy efficiency approaches, whether they're policy investments in capacity building or physical infrastructure investments. So for instance, detailed data collection on individual household or business level use of energy, making that information and data accessible on a personal or a household basis so that people can make better decisions about what they're doing with their energy. That requires a lot of capacity. It requires investment in a digital framework so that customers can access it. Singapore is in a place where that's doable. We're starting to see trials like that in other ASEAN countries like Malaysia, for instance, which has one of its utilities doing this to great success to improve energy efficiency. But most countries just don't have the internal capacity. And Singapore's expertise in digital innovation really makes it an opportunity to sort of export that lesson learned and that experience to other countries in ASEAN that are just starting to look at how to manage demand side and how to modernize the utility operations. Other examples include things like digitalizing and automating management of certain building features. So that could be things like the lighting controls or even the air conditioning, which is actually a huge driver of electricity demand around Southeast Asia, given that the hot temperatures. So automating those things can improve the overall efficiency of those systems rather than leaving people to turn them on or off at their own will, sometimes forgetting what they've done. And at the same time, other things in the public space, such as street lighting, can also be automated for great improvements to overall efficiency. And finally, I'll throw out one additional technology, which I think is still really getting off the ground, but is an opportunity, again, for Singapore to sort of take the lead in coordination with the United States and other development partners with the technical expertise in this space. And that's the use of blockchain technology in the energy sector. So we've started to see pilot projects in Thailand where a blockchain is used to support peer-to-peer trading systems. It can also be used to support essentially secure renewable energy certification systems. So blockchain in energy is essentially a way to ensure that when someone is producing electricity, particularly one unit of renewable electricity, and then they're selling that to someone else, whether that is another peer company or the utilities, that you can confirm who is buying the renewable energy and you don't have duplicates of certification. So for instance, this could be very useful for Singapore as it looks to, as a national entity, to move away from over-reliance on natural gas through electricity trade with neighbors in ASEAN by investing in a renewable energy certification system. It can also be used at sort of a company level where you've got, for instance, a manufacturing company in Cambodia or a financing institute in Singapore that has a brand commitment to move towards renewable energy or carbon neutrality, and they need to purchase that from an external user. So there's an opportunity here to really enhance the opportunities for ASEAN's renewable electricity trading. And it's just getting off the ground. We haven't seen a lot of investment in other ASEAN countries in this space yet. Blockchain is still something that I think many governments are trying to wrap their heads around in terms of what they want their national policies to be. And there's space here for some capacity building and potentially also for sort of normalizing and standardizing what that renewable energy certification process would look like. And I think this is particularly important as you have countries like Laos, for instance, which are seeking long-term opportunities to sell electricity through the ASEAN power grid to Singapore to take advantage of their significant existing hydropower capacity and then the potential future solar or wind capacity to help Singapore specifically and ASEAN more broadly pursue their carbon emissions reduction targets under COP26. So I'm going to go ahead and pause there. I think there's a lot more we can talk about some of these specific opportunities, and there's probably space to talk about what private sector is doing in this space, what government is doing in this space, where we can build on sort of third-party training approaches. But I want to go ahead and sort of pause there and turn things over to Natalie so that we can have an interactive discussion with all of you.
Great. Thank you so much, Courtney, for that informative presentation. I know I was taking copious notes, thinking through what some of the ramifications are across ASEAN and then drilling down further into Singapore. So just like you said, I think let's move on to the next presentation. So Dr. Natalie Pang is a senior lecturer and deputy head at Communications and New Media Department and principal investigator at the Center for Trusted Internet and Community at the National University of Singapore and US. She's a researcher and educator in digital citizenship and well-being, as well as digital humanities and data cultures in smart cities. She has published in various top-tier journals, including New Media and Society, Computers and Human Behavior, Telematics and Informatics, and the Journal of the Association of Information Science and Technology. She also serves on a number of editorial boards, including Asian Journal of Communication and the International Journal of Information, Diversity, and Inclusion. Dr. Natalie Pang, if you would, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian. I want to start first by thanking the U.S. Embassy in Singapore as well as Pacific Forum for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here to share my remarks on this important topic. So I just a little bit of about myself and my work to ground what I'm going to share. Right, I work very much in the context of digital transformations and digital technologies in smart cities, especially looking at the intersection of data innovation and digital equity and inclusion. I also work with think tanks and foundations to publish white papers and commentaries for public education. And as part of this, I guess, trajectory of work, in 2020, I collaborated with Missions Publics and as well as leads from over 70 countries to organize the first citizens dialogue on the internet. So a lot of what I'm going to share, right, are also learning points from the experience. Right now, I'm working on a new research project, right, looking at plastic waste in households that's generated by households, in particular, focusing on women and how they actually participate and contribute to online discourse about household waste, right? And also how they learn from these online communities to inform their own household practices. So that is a new project, and I'm very happy to be here, right, to connect with the very topic of sustainability, energies, and climate change. So let me, I guess, first begin by acknowledging that I think one good thing that has come out of the COVID-19 pandemic for the past 2 years is this new level of awareness I'm seeing about the importance of digital equity and inclusion more than ever across different circles that I interact in, from social service to civil society to academia and government agencies. Actually, people I know are talking about the importance of digital access for people to function at work, sustain their relationships, keep their family bonds, as well as tackle complex issues such as climate change and reduction of waste in the environment. So I think from my vantage point, conversations about digital equity and inclusion, right, they have gained a lot of momentum, especially in the past 2 years, right? And there's been a lot of recommendations and policies developed that are centered on addressing accessibility, right, and to digital devices, right, promoting internet access and looking at how we can actually be inclusive in terms of working with communities across various issues, right? And I think they remain important because the digital gaps that have surfaced, they are very much reflective also of class divides, socioeconomic divides, and the more affluent and educated being much further ahead than others, not just in terms of their knowledge and the kinds of action they are able to take, but also how much they are able to participate in co-creating sustainable solutions. But I also hold the view that the time is now to expand the conversations beyond accessibility and literacy. Digital policies that focus on deployment, regardless of the areas of deployment, for instance, right, tackling issues about climate change and energy, I think it's really important to go beyond, actually access and soliciting participation to meaningful, engaging communities in meaningful deliberations about what is being built, what data is being collected, right, and how they can actually also work with communities and use dialogue as the process to collaborate on setting sustainable goals. This is also important because I think at the end of each program, each policy, each initiative, it is about, at the very heart of it, it is about people. It is about building community capacity for self-reliance and resilience. For instance, during the Internet Citizens Dialogue that I organized in Singapore, participants deliberated on the kinds of internet futures they envision, and a lot of that future involved how do we live in a sustainable world, right? How do we actually work with each other to deal with actually green technologies that may be very new to us, right? I think therefore, right, the importance of such dialogues, right, it really surfaces, right, as a way for participants to actually understand what is actually being deployed and how they can understand it, as well as what are the implications for them in terms of their work, play, and how they live their lives, right? I think I think many of us in this room probably knows the Singapore Green Plan 2030, right, which was launched in February last year, I believe, and quite central to the Green Plan is a series of Green Plan conversations, right? And in each of these conversations, I'm just showing one example of that series of conversations, right? In each of these conversations, co-creation and deliberation about trade-offs, about what is sustainable living, for instance, right? Why it matters, and how we can actually deal with how we can actually come up with alternative solutions, right, together with citizens, is quite key. The next thing I guess I really want to talk about is really how, as cities grow more digitalized, right, alongside the growth of surveillance technologies during the pandemic, I think what I'm also seeing is this parallel debate about the area of data security and privacy. In fact, I think the very concept of smart cities is premised very much on data collection, right? Much of that, the developments I see has been very centered on legal provisions and frameworks to guide the current era of data collection, data use and exchange, that is really one of the key drivers of digital innovations in smart cities. But at the same time, there has been heightened concerns about privacy, and it has contributed to important developments such as the European Union GDPR, right, the General Data Protection Regulation. And we can see how conversations and debates about GDPR, right, has also been talking about how the GDPR is protective of the personal data rights for individuals, right, including those that are more vulnerable. But at the same time, it's an approach that is very consent-centric. But consider the extent to which informed consent is meaningful, right? And this is really, I think, a lot of my work with communities, sort of interrogates this issue, right? For many who are highly reliant on technological platforms for their livelihoods, not agreeing to the terms and conditions that are associated with the use of personal data can in fact threaten their very livelihoods, right? So is there a choice here? Additionally, I think making sense of lengthy notification clauses, right, comprising legal clauses, right, can be seen as a difficult journey for many vulnerable populations to navigate, right? Even though organizations may try their best, right, in making such statements concise, transparent, intelligent, and so on. Perhaps these gaps were very well recognized, right, as they were issues that the Asia Pacific Office of the Future of Privacy Forum, right, also recognized in their advocacy for the owners for data protection to move from end users to organizations. So in the context of smart cities in Asia, right, the cross-border privacy rules, right, is one example of that reflects similar thinking in terms of placing greater accountability on organizations and governments rather than placing the onus on the end users to protect their own data. But coming back to my earlier point, right, I think digital policies, must go beyond deployment to consider how communities understand what is being built, what kinds of policies are being, formed around them, right, and how their lives will be affected. In Singapore, last year, revelations about how our contact tracing data in our contact tracing app traced together will be actually used for purposes, right, beyond what most citizens understood, right, have also triggered much debate, confusion, as well as frustration when revelations came out, right. I think for me, the last thing we want to do, right, is to have citizens who are disengaged, disillusioned, and distrustful of all the technologies that are being deployed, which is why I advocate, right, for looking at data citizenship as a new form of citizenship that we can consider. I think what is missing for many individuals is this culture of talking about data collection and use, right, to provide them with sufficient context to make sense of all the policies that are actually formed around them. Data citizenship can be one way, right, where we can consider designing a series of activities and forums as well as programs as interventions in empowering citizens, including those that are most vulnerable, to participate in this conversation. This may be done using a community-based approach, and I'm just showing one example from my past research, right? For instance, this is Joint Data is an initiative from the Netherlands for farmers to better control what data about their farms is shared with whom, right? It is a way for citizens, and in this particular case, farmers, to view and understand what kinds of data, right, third-party entities have about them and how they share it. Right. But of course, and this is my final remarks, right, working with communities can be complex and fraught with challenges. How one manages the divergent interests and priorities that can be coming from individuals within the same community, right, is it's not an easy or straightforward by any means. And how we can balance efficiency while also being inclusive, right, is still a difficult juggling act. But nevertheless, I think such approaches, right, community-based approaches, still affords greater opportunities for individuals, for citizens to have more inputs and control over how they live, how they work, and how they play in smart cities, especially in the context of sustainable smart cities. They will also have, through such mechanisms, have a way to define how they will participate and collaborate on sustainable goals, and most of all, have a community to turn to when things go wrong. So with that, let me end my presentation. Happy to take any comments or questions. Over to you, Christian.
Thank you, Natalie, for that really informative presentation and the really beautiful slides as well. I think I enjoy. They're super appealing just in terms of looking at the different bullet points. It's a welcome change from just 3 bullet points and the main title. Really appreciate that. At this point, so I definitely want to make sure that the audience is aware that the chat feature and the Q&A box are open for your engagement, so that you may ask questions of our panelists. So just as a reminder, you've got 2 options for asking questions. One is to raise your hand in the webinar controls, and that's accessible from the participants tab. And the other is to open the Q&A window. And to ask a question, you can type your question into the Q&A box and click send. If you do raise your hand to ask a question verbally, the host will enable your microphone and ask you to unmute yourself. As you know, we are trapped in terms of the mute world until you unmute yourself. So please be ready to unmute yourself. So we'll wait for some of the questions to come in. But in the meantime, I want to emphasize at the beginning, when Crystal ran our poll for our participants, one of the things they noted was that there were other economic priorities that were stymieing the growth of some of our sustainability policies across ASEAN. And I think you addressed that really well, Courtney, in terms of understanding that the tension between the reliability of fossil fuels and the hopes and the benefits of renewables, it still comes with a number of costs that we deal with, and specifically the data, the decentralization aspect of it. And I think that was a really perfect transition into exactly what Dr. Pong was prescribing. And that was the other poll result, that privacy and policies related to data, and let's call it smart cities for lack of a better, broader term, really is a concern. And of course, I don't think we have, a statistically valid number here to draw any incredible conclusions. But I think Dr. Pong really hit upon that the aspect of inclusion, who to include, the voices that we're hearing, these are concerns for citizens. From my interesting point of view, which might be a little bit different, is I work with companies, both U.S. companies, but also Singaporean companies, and in a similar way to reflect this divide. And of course, I'll admit that's already a tiny sliver, right? That's industry, but within industry, there's also a tremendous amount of diversity, and we can split things out just in terms of large and small businesses, multinational corporations and small and medium enterprises, and for us, U.S. Congress mandates that we really emphasize our work on SMEs, right? Small and medium enterprises. And we hear time and time again that, one, they're not aware of the frameworks that exist, the types of policies that, concerned or not, policymakers are implementing, moving forward with other industry that has interests in creating compliance standards, and it's difficult for small enterprises, and I think there's a parallel, of course, for drawing that on private citizens that may not be tuned into every single Pacific Forum conversation that we're hosting, but it's hard for them to understand where we are in that conversation, and raising that awareness. I think is a cost for governments as well as for companies, and that's a difficult aspect of it. So we have smart cities. I think both of our presenters here are discussing smart cities. Right? I think the allure of smart cities, we're all moving towards it. I think two of the three of us are based here in Singapore, and so of course it's hailed as one of the smartest cities. I think owing a lot to its size, it has these advantages that essentially coast to coast, north to south. It's a very smart place, but I think this gets captured. A lot of things get thrown into the bucket, right, of smart cities. It's almost like whatever the flavor of the day is, whether it's a bureaucrat, a diplomat, or an academic, or a private sector individual. It's a smart cities initiative, right? How do you prioritize, and really open to, I think, both of your different perspectives. What does smart cities mean, I think, in the context of your work, both in ASEAN and in Singapore, and specifically here of the topic we're discussing with the sustainable, digital solutions for smart cities. And I'll say that in the context that, of course, Singapore is hosting the Smart City Summit, just as it always does, but this will be in person in the middle of the summer.
I guess I'll go ahead and take a stab at answering first, and a little bit of this is going to be some broad thinking, but one of the things that struck me as you were talking about smart cities and hearing Natalie talk about smart cities as well is sort of the unique position that Singapore finds itself in, because when you look at ASEAN broadly, for instance, there's a huge portion of the population that actually doesn't live in a city at all. So when we're thinking about inclusivity, when we're thinking about access, when we're thinking about digitalization, for a vast swath of people, this is something that that they're not even thinking about yet because they don't have internet access, or they only have internet access from their phone when it's charged. And so, it does strike to me sort of that challenge of how are we ensuring equal access to information? How are we ensuring all of the benefits that come from digitalization, the technologies that we're talking about here today, can reach these communities that are rural? Sometimes these rural communities, many of them, they don't want to move to a city. They like their life, they like the culture, they like the tradition, but they also like the benefits, the improved access to health, the improved access to higher living standards that come with cities. So I think that's an interesting tension that I've seen often in the work that I do in mainland Southeast Asia, and we travel between Bangkok, for instance, and communities living along the Mekong River that are concerned about dam development. And one of the things that I have thought a lot about is sort of the extent to which some of these benefits of smart cities can be relocated to rural areas. So for instance, when we're talking about decentralization in the energy sector, I'm thinking a lot about these pilot projects that I see in Bangkok or that I see in Vietnam with rooftop solar, where it's all integrated into the grid. A lot of it's done by commercial buildings, by industry that has a clear benefit in terms of cost benefit analysis, that it will save them money to produce some of their own energy and then sell the excess into the grid. We've also seen some really innovative pilot projects for instance, rural mini grids, where you've got small communities in relatively remote areas where instead of building out this big national infrastructure that links them into all of these information flows and data systems that we're talking about, and which are very familiar, I think, to many of you living in Singapore, but have some of those benefits at the local micro level, where you've got a number of households that are connected with grids, that are connected with batteries. They have to deal with some of these same challenges, but the scale is entirely different. So I'll just sort of throw that out there with some thoughts about sort of the challenges of smart cities. I mean, again, I think that there's real opportunities here, there's real innovations, and there's equal value in thinking about not only how these work as part of a large national system, but how they can work at the micro level for communities that don't live in a city.
Yeah, I'll just chime in here. Thanks for the question, Christian. And I agree with everything that Courtney is saying. I think for me, the way I think of smart cities, I mean, beyond the obvious innovations, technological innovations, for me, smart cities has to consider the humanistic aspect of development. For me, it's some smart cities will be a smart city if actually people living in a country, right, they are able to thrive, be it actually using innovations for learning, using innovations to connect, and also to participate at a very I guess national or even community or meso level, right? In terms of dealing with issues such as climate change and sustainability. A smart city is also one where you have a network of communities, right? And that network is not just individuals, but that network is also something that is empowered and driven by civil society to actually organize and to mobilize, right? Especially when it comes to solutioning and also problem identification. So, Christian, you talked about, you just now, I wanted to also connect with one of the points that you mentioned earlier, right? When you talked about how, you work very much with industry and, actually SMEs, right? And I want to also say that I think this is also what I observe as I have a similar observation and also what I guess conclude as a gap, right? I think across different countries, especially in Asia, the drive towards, I guess, digitalization and innovations, even in the area of sustainability, is very much, I guess, driven by industries and the states, where, private enterprises, SMEs, and two big ones, right? They drive the hardware, the technological aspects of innovations, and the state actually, I guess, they have several roles, right? Sometimes it's an arbitrator, right? They hold organizations to accountable to standards that have been set. Sometimes they are coordinators, sometimes they are facilitators of innovation at the national level. But I think there is more, right? There is I think a missing piece here, which is civil society, right, and communities to come in to also play that role in terms of actually having a seat at the same table, right, in terms of working with industry as well as governments in various applications of smart cities, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The aspect of building a community and Singapore's unique role within ASEAN. Of course, having the most developed economy, sort of the GDP, just in terms of the per capita, in terms of its advancement on different policies, right, really helps it stand apart. For good and for better or for worse, right? As Courtney, as you were mentioning, and I'll drive a personal example. I can see Johor, right, in Malaysia, from our balcony, and yet I've never been able to be there because of when I arrived and because of circuit breaker and the restrictions. And so my limited view, and I know it's limited, I've got the blinders of Singapore and it's here. And I know that the rest of ASEAN is even just there across the strait, right? And it's difficult because I think very much about our relationship, that is the US government and the Singaporean relationship, and how we try to leverage that across the region to apply some best practices. For example, as you were saying, Dr. Pong, in terms of building that community, we think of different stakeholders within the smart cities community. So that could be cyber officials, right, involved in really defense related aspects, but that could also be a public utilities board member here in Singapore that watches over the dedicated water infrastructure and is in charge of, let's say, procurement, right? And he or she is just interested in connecting with other individuals across ASEAN that potentially he or she could share some of those best practices with. And that is something that we've done very closely with the State Department and also across the US-Singapore Smart Cities Partnership to essentially help pay for some of these different members to typically come together either in Singapore, and of course all this was 2019 and before, but also now as things are opening up to try to come to different shows or different conferences in the US. And not because we are trying to really tell them anything. What we want is for them to build that community amongst themselves and have that resilience to reach out to somebody, whether it's on WhatsApp or Vine or email, right, and say, hey, I've got these questions. I'm facing these difficulties. Are you seeing that? But it is a challenge with the difference in terms of the development gap that we have. And it's something that I think working with Singaporean officials, we're very sensitive to make sure that we're addressing the right levels and the right issues. I want to maybe just kind of switch topics to something that I think involves almost crisis level aspects here, and it does touch on SMEs and also electricity. Very much, as Courtney, you were mentioning, electricity markets, the regulation. Just read a Channel News Asia Today story about the Jinjia Chicken, everybody's favorite Korean fast food chain here, and essentially all their profits being eaten up by their utility bill, right? Electricity bills running quite high because of the different issues, but essentially switching over beyond the controlled tariff plans and onto the spot pricing market, which is difficult for companies to control, and especially since they have to maintain their power on all the time. It presents really a difficult problem. As a consumer, we can try to say, okay, I won't do my dishes or my laundry at a certain time to avoid peak load. But as a business that has to operate during certain hours, you're really dealing with a whole different host of issues. And here you're back to this issue that you were saying, Courtney, of smart meters, decentralization, but also some real core aspects of where is the power coming from, and does the market feel like it can provide a steady stream of power for not just fried chicken, right, but more importantly, the development of that country's products, right? Their industry, their development, whether it's processing raw commodities or moving up the value chain to, let's say in Malaysia, the advanced manufacture of semiconductors as well. These are really difficult issues. How can we as policymakers bring together some of these issues to the table, especially in the context of some of the broader discussions related to the Indo-Pacific economic framework that are taking place? So really open-ended question, right? What would you like to see is essentially what I'm saying. And we have a chance with something that was signed. It's a bilateral MOU in November that was announced between the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Secretary Raimondo, and the Minister of Trade and Industry, Minister Gan here in Singapore. It's the Partnership for Growth and Innovation. So we have room to address some of these issues. And as both of you, sort of experts on this confluence of themes, you know, as we start to wrap up, I'd like to ask, what would you like to see?
Well, I guess I'll go ahead and go first again, just to sort of touch on some of the energy challenges that you raise. And, you know, I think I'm not as familiar with Singapore's domestic situation, but I do know that they are far in advance of many of their ASEAN neighbors in terms of trialing new technologies in the energy market, whether that's things like battery storage or floating solar, or in some cases, integration of rooftop solar. I know that Singapore is also far in advance in terms of liberalizing the energy market. So a lot of the other countries in ASEAN are still on a somewhat fixed tariff system, particularly for companies, but also for households in many of the countries where they're still trying to expand electricity access. There's specific efforts to either drop the price of electricity or limit it simply because they want to ensure electricity access to people. So I do think that there's a number of sort of lessons learned, both good lessons and challenging lessons learned from Singapore's experiences, sort of utilizing these new market approaches, but in particular utilizing these technology approaches. And I think in the technology space, there's a lot of very successful lessons that Singapore has to offer to its ASEAN neighbors. And there's real opportunities for the United States and Singapore through some of the third country technical training programs to share those case studies with their neighbors in ASEAN in ways that can put them to use. And I know that there is a lot of private sector interest in Singapore already, for instance, in taking some of those lessons learned with floating solar and exporting them to neighboring countries. So I think that there's investment interest in Cambodia. I know a number of Singapore projects in the renewable energy sector that are building on sort of the technical expertise and some of the experiences with these pilot projects in Singapore to take those to Cambodia. I'm sure that there's many more in Malaysia and Indonesia and the Philippines, given the size of these markets. So I do think there's kind of an obvious opportunity there for government-led capacity building or government-supported capacity building that would have payoffs down the road for Singaporean companies that are interested in then investing in these growing markets elsewhere in ASEAN. So I would like to see, I think, more sort of ASEAN-wide coordination on those third country training programs, simply because I think there's a lot to offer. And I think Singapore is an ideal partner in this space, particularly with some of those digitalization technologies that we talked about.
Yeah, thanks, Christian, for the question. In terms of what I'd like to see, when I think about sustainability, I often, I guess, associate it with human sustainability. And to me, that is the ultimate goal of that is really how do we, I guess, preserve and also how do we look after current resources for the future generations. So for me, the current way of consumption, perhaps it's something that I would love to actually see more, as I mentioned, community-based dialogues, community-based programs and initiatives that are done in collaboration with, actually, entities from the people sector, right? From civil society to academics to also think tanks and so on, to really, I think, engage people, right, in terms of how we think about looking after current resources for the future. I'm aware of the case you mentioned of ginger chicken, right? And how, I guess for many SMEs like them, there's also that question of how can we be sustainable, right? If the cost of electricity keeps going up, right? And where is that energy going to come from next to continue fueling and continue driving our business? So I think it needs to be a multi-stakeholder dialogue, right? The advocates and also citizens, they cannot do this alone. It has to be a multi-stakeholder dialogue, and that's, I guess, one thing I would love to see more of, especially at the ASEAN, cooperation level across, different countries as well. Yeah. Okay, if I may also add one more point, right? I think that idea of, I think in one of the earlier points you raised, right, is this also idea of how do we actually identify standards, principles and accounts, principles of accountability, right? And I think this is this can be quite challenging for ASEAN because it's a very diverse region, right? I think harmonization is always going to be very difficult, but I do think that the way to go is to use a bottom-up, work with communities on the ground, use a bottom-up approach, right? But from there, we could also identify some principles that may be converging.
I'll actually just chime in to quickly pick up on and continue a point that Natalie just made about the opportunities to include bottom-up engagement. I think with digital access, even though I mentioned earlier that there are challenges in many areas with people not having access to the internet, not having digital access, we are sort of in an era right now where it is easier than ever to find ways to gather feedback and include people than it ever has been before. And equally, it's easier than ever to share big data takeaways and information and analytical tools online with people who historically never would have had access to some of those tools. So for instance, our team does a lot of work collecting, on open data, collecting openly available data on infrastructure projects, whether that's power generation, whether that's roads, rails, waterways, putting that out there. We have an online tool where anyone in the Mekong region can come on and run a search for what power projects are under development in their country, what's the status of them. They can look into details on who's developing them. And then they can take that and have conversations about it at their local level, drilling down to their province, drilling down to their district. That type of information, historically information didn't want to be free. It was often locked up in government annals or other records. And now a lot of that's just out there and it's accessible to people. So people also have the opportunity to substantively contribute to these dialogues in a way that I think was very difficult even 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, and indeed, I agree. And it really also challenges the idea of the city, right? I just want to share like a personal anecdote, right? In my travels, I often take my bicycle and I cycle around. I go out of the city and I cycle to the rural areas, right? And I distinctively remember, for the past few years before the pandemic hit, I have been traveling to China. I cycle to the rural area, and I think just a span of 2-3 years, right? I saw rapid developments in terms of how digitalized, right, the rural area is in China, right? One farm, one family I met, they are farmers, right? They have their children living and studying in another city, right? And they use WeChat, right, to communicate with their children daily, right? But at the same time, there is also a lot of data gathering, not just at the state level, but also at a provincial level, right down to the individual community level, right? So I think that's the kind of things I see, right? For me, that kind of developments, right, has been very rapid. It's going on not just in China, right, but also other parts of Asia, and how we think about the city, right, and all that. It's will need to change.
Yeah, I think it's definitely blurring. Natalie, Courtney, I want to thank you so much for today's conversation. I think we could keep talking for hours. I wish we could, sit around and have a glass of coffee and I think try to solve these problems or at least discuss them. But for this, now I'm going to pass it back to Crystal to make some closing remarks before we end today's program.
Thank you so much, Christian, and thank you so much to our panelists for a really interesting discussion on a super fascinating topic. So we hope this is just the beginning of the discussion and not the end. A big thank you also to our participants for taking the time to join us today and listen in on the happenings. We hope that you'll continue staying engaged with Pacific Forum programming, which you can find out more about on our website, www.pacforum.org. We plan to hold the penultimate session of this series next month. The topic for the next session is securing critical national infrastructure in the financial and healthcare sectors. So please stay tuned for more details by subscribing to Pacific Forum or following us on social media. I'd also like to remind you of the post-event survey, which we'll share again in the chat box now. We would really appreciate if you take a few minutes to complete it and share your feedback so we can make sure our next sessions are as engaging and productive as possible. Thank you once again to our speakers, moderator, and participants for joining us today and making this discussion really enlightening. We hope that we will see you at the remaining 2 events in these series. Thank you.